Welcome to the Western Baul Podcast Series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled Conscious Surrender, Deepening Our Role in the Spiritual Process and Why It Matters. The talk was given by Vijaya Fedorschak on July 27, 2024, via Zoom. Vijaya is the organizer of the Western Baul Podcast Series and author of The Shadow on the Path and Father and Son. In this talk, the principle of surrender is explored. It could be said that the spiritual process is all about surrender. Writings by the Indian master Swami Papa Ramdas and the American master Lee Lozowick are discussed. It is noted that the testimonies of sages and masters in different traditions throughout the ages can inspire us to practice conscious surrender, accepting what is as it is and then acting. Vijay considers that surrender is surrender to self, to that which moves all of life, but that it is not so easy to distinguish between self and ego. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Vijaya Fedorschak.
This is such a deep topic. There's actually so much that I would like to talk about. So I'm just going to start. And we'll just take some breaks for you to input as you'd like. But as with most, if not all, speakers who present here as part of the Saturday Night Talk series, those talks get edited into the Western Baul Podcast Series. I want to bring something that's really relevant for me and that I'm working on, and that also hopefully will be of some value for you to consider. So, to take a closer look at what surrender is on the path, to me, it seems to cut to the heart of the issue. And I know that there's a lot of different language and ways of talking about the path, but from one perspective, that's all it's about. So let's start with some excerpts from the writing of Swami Ramdas, who was one of the great 20th century spiritual masters of India. That was included in a description for the talk. And then I'd like to go through that sentence by sentence and have some discussion about that to start anyway. Maybe I'll read the whole thing through first. The aim of all religions is to point out the path that leads to perfect freedom, peace, and joy. This blessed state can be realized only by the eradication of the ego sense through surrender. To teach this great truth came Krishna, Buddha, Christ, and Muhammad. Mere intellectual understanding of religious truths is different from actual spiritual experience. It must be understood that to love and serve God is to love and serve all beings and creatures. To realize God is to be conscious of his presence everywhere. That is really a lot. There's a lot packed in there. And so a couple questions occurred to me that I wrote as part of the description. What does eradication of the ego sense actually mean? If we consider God's presence is everywhere, not separate from us, masculine and feminine, how does that change our view of ourselves? If we see needless recurrent suffering in ourselves and the world as an expression of the avoidance of surrender, what are ways we can practically learn to apply this principle for our benefit and the benefit of others, and why does this matter? So the aim of all traditions is to point the path that leads to perfect freedom, peace, and joy. Ramdas was such a joyful person. Accounts of people who stayed with him or visited him always seem to emphasize his laughter and his humor. It seems that humor is a common aspect of all realizers. my reference point for this is the Indian spiritual master Yogi Ram Surat Kumar, who actually had Papa Ram Das as his master. And on 4 trips that I was lucky enough to go on in India, in sitting with him, his body would shake with laughter. Like, why is he so radiant? What is going on there? And I can only surmise that if one realizes who one is, a real I, beyond the ego identity, that one is relaxed in relationship and can see the humor in this situation where people are just running on a treadmill all the time. And there's such compassion for them because it's not just I reside in peace and joy and freedom and the heck with everybody else. Their life is dedicated to other beings, to all that is. That's really a lot to consider. We know that, but there's really a shift that occurs when that's one state of being. That's huge, and that's evident in all traditions. And people recount stories of finding themselves outside of their ordinary state in the presence of such beings like Swami Ram Das or Yogi Ram Surat Kumar, and that certainly was the case for me. So Ram Das implies that those of us who haven't realized the aim of all religions, pretty much all of us, don't live in perfect freedom, peace, and joy. But he says that that's possible. So I was thinking, when I was a boy, I was so struck by realizing that no one lived in the state. No one lived in perfect freedom, peace, and joy. It was like, this is the norm, and profoundly disappointing for me. I couldn't put words to it, but upsetting, as I recall. I was trained to look at God as a separate being, and it never would occur to me in catechism class to raise my hand and say, that doesn't actually feel right to me. I'm not really sure about that. Could we talk about this for a little bit? Who's going to do that as a kid? Everyone would look around at you and give you the eyeball, like, what's the matter with you? And then this is just kind of stream of consciousness, things that came to me as a preface to discussing surrender. As a teenager, I remember that there was this hit song that hit the charts. I never heard one like it. Maybe some of you remember it. It was really disturbing, but it seemed so honest. I'd never heard a song like that and don't know that I ever have since. It was Is That All There Is by Peggy Lee. She spoke the lyrics to these verses with music playing in the background, and then she sang the chorus. I just got inspired to read some of these lyrics so I could really depress it. And by the way, this song was arranged by Randy Newman. He was the guy who wrote Short People. I didn't know that. Okay, so here's some of the lyrics. And when I was 12 years old, with music in the background, my daddy took me to the circus, the greatest show on earth. There were clowns and elephants, dancing bears, and a beautiful lady in pink tights flew high above our heads. And as I sat there watching, I had the feeling that something was missing. I don't know what, but when it was over, I said to myself, is that all there is to the circus? Is that all there is? And then the chorus. Is that all there is? If that's all there is, my friends, then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the booze and have a ball, if that's all there is. And then she says that she meets the boy and they fall deeply in love, and then he leaves. And she thought she would die, but she didn't. And she ends up thinking to herself, is that all there is to love? Is that all there is? And then finally, this is therapeutic to me to remember this song. The final verse goes, I know what you must be saying to yourselves. If that's the way she feels about it, why doesn't she just end it all? Oh no, not me. I'm not ready for that final disappointment because I know, just as well as I'm standing here talking to you, that when that final moment comes and I'm breathing my last breath, I'll be saying to myself, is that all there is? And then at the end of high school, I've just recently been to New York where I grew up. I remember in high school getting ready to enter college and being really stressed about this. And someone who might be considered a guide in some way, not really, but something like that. He said, you have the choice of going to college and being a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond. And that to me summarized what I had learned that the purpose of life was: to strive to find something that was bearable, make a living at, and derive some satisfaction from accomplishing something in a small pond or a big pond. I mean, that's what life was about. And so then I got into a field that I thought I would enjoy. And after working in it for a while, I said to myself, without using these words, is that all there is? And I felt like I did as a kid, but now as a young adult, this is just the norm. This is how life is. And then I was so shocked to unexpectedly run into a different kind of teacher or guide and come across the ideas that God is everything, all that is, not a separate being, and that we are more than this separate ego idea of ourselves that we identify as, and that there's a way out of suffering, that freedom, peace, and love are actually possible. But that would require surrender. What does that mean? In my naivete, I had different ideas about what that would mean. So to continue with the reading from Ram Dass, this blessed state can be realized only by eradication of the ego sense through surrender. To teach this great truth came Krishna, Buddha, Christ, Muhammad. So I had all kinds of ideas of what this meant. Ego is bad. It should be sublimated. I should never be angry or in conflict. I should really mask my ego from others, but especially from myself, and pretend it's not a factor. And then I started to get that ego is a constant. It's part of being human, and that we can't exist without an ego. In fact, there's no such thing as a big ego or a small ego. It sure seems like there is. But the idea that there are just different expressions of ego, different manifestations of a limitation of a separate person. And that, frankly, that principle permeates all of life. And that there's just identification, and the path is about finding out if that's all there is. And I started to get that by eradicating the ego. Ram Dass and others probably meant that ego surrenders its control so the universe can come through you. It can blow through you like wind blows through a hollow bamboo. And that made sense. There's so many things that are out of ego's control. The moon and the stars, the body, how it functions. It's just so obvious that there's so many things we can't control, and yet we try and try and try. And it seems like that's the cause of there being no peace, freedom, and joy. What if you let that go? But nonetheless, we do this. We can control so few things. We can't control our wives or our husbands. We can't control our children. We can't control the weather. We can't control the election, what people say or do. We can't control the dog barking. I sit 6 days a week in our meditation space, and there's this dog who lives next door, and he likes to come out just at that time of day. And sometimes this goes throughout the whole period of meditation. I could be really upset by that, or just make it part of my meditation. And insects. And my house is not overrun with cockroaches, but they do enter sometimes. And there have been like 4 in the last month. And I could put traps all around them like that, but they're here to stay. I'm looking at this one the other day and I'm saying, hey, listen, buddy, this isn't really a great place for you. If you just keep coming in, if you're hanging out there, probably that's going to be all there is for you. And okay, so I just surrender to the situation and take off my flip-flop and send him into another realm. There are just so many things that we cannot control, and yet we try. It's not like it's not important to try to make things happen, but it's the way that we do that. I just got this text from somebody, and he is in the hospital, and he's in a serious situation. You really can't control that. It's so beneficial to me to learn the principle of surrender and to practice it in life, because we have minor situations and moderate situations and then serious situations. And it's probably unlikely that we're going to be able to surrender to serious situations if we haven't really practiced. That's just practical also. And it was also surprising to me that this principle of surrender was true in all the traditions. In Buddhism, there's this idea of emptiness, of being an empty vessel. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. And it also seemed that this idea of there being no God, which is the case in Buddhism, they don't talk about God at all, is the same thing as everything being God. It's just what is. And we can call it God or we can not call it God. We can be theistic about it or not, but it is what it is. And how to learn how to live in relationship to that in a way that produces freedom, joy, and peace, rather than just going along with the norm. So in Sufism, there's this idea of fana, which is the passing away of the lower self, or nafs, into a state of love for God. In Hinduism, the concept of Atman and Brahman. Atman is the individual soul, and Brahman is the universal soul. And they merge, they can merge. So they're actually one and the same. In fact, they're one and the same right now. And we don't realize that is the idea, I think, in Hinduism. And in the Gurdjieff work, as I understand it, there's an idea of a real I, of living from essence as opposed to personality. And the only way that that makes sense to me in terms of this teaching is that if one is surrendered in an abiding way to the process of life, then one has a real I. I don't see any other way that it can happen myself. I mean, you can strengthen the ego and really develop personal power, but to me, that's not the same. And I don't know that it holds up in the end. So many realizers in the traditions have been examples of this and have spoken about this principle. We aren't like these masters, but maybe we are at the deepest level. And we're just on the path. In this realm of time and space, the process is moving. But just to know that there's a path to perfect freedom, peace, and joy, whatever that means, because we'll have all these ideas about what that means, that can be very helpful. How can we apply the spiritual principle of surrender from the traditions in our own lives, in our own time and space? To me, that's where the rubber meets the road. So then to continue with what Ram Dass is saying, it must be understood that to love and serve God is to love and serve all beings and creatures. To realize God is to be conscious of his presence everywhere. To me, that is profound. Okay, I can say that God's presence is everywhere, but if that's the truth, that's true right now, right here on Zoom. And that's worthy of paying attention to. Most of the times we just get caught in our own mental chatter, our own ego is running the show, and we don't remember that. And to accept that that's how it is to be a human being, but also to work. So Ram Dass, he saw Ram, his Ishta Devata, his chosen deity, or God, everywhere. When he had this awakening experience, he got on a train and he went on pilgrimage throughout India for a year. And as the story goes, as the legend goes, he saw everything as Ram. And he didn't have enough money to buy train tickets. He'd just get on the train and he'd get kicked off and he'd say, Ram told me to leave the train. So I got off. And we got back home and it wasn't just all residing in peace and joy. Then he started teaching, being a servant. Ram Dass means servant of God. I mean, we don't see these great spiritual masters so much as servants, but they are really serving God, which is really the same as serving humanity. It doesn't mean that everyone who surrenders is going to be a teacher, not at all. But Ram Dass is saying that in that state, one is moved to love and serve all beings and creatures in our own unique way. Mere intellectual understanding of religious truths is different from actual spiritual experience. What does it mean to be one with God if ego surrenders or is surrendered? We can imagine what that's like, and I think that a lot of the spiritual scene is about that, imagining to be enlightened or what that is like. But I think that's more of ego's trickery in most cases. Self-observation with ruthless honesty, but without judgment, is an important principle in working on oneself. And also, ego avoids surrender at all costs. So we like this idea, but also if we observe ourselves, we see that that's not really something I'm interested in at all. Surrender is seen as death. I can surrender in pretty easeful situations. Somebody steps in front of me, and then we're walking along, and then I can hold the door for them. That's fine. But in situations where I'm really identified, that's a different story. It's not so easy, but very valuable to consider how that works. It seems to be some kind of a paradox that surrender, I'm just going to let go and give things up and don't have to do anything. But it seems to me effort is necessary. Our attention is all over the place. So if we don't make some efforts, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to be able to surrender an ego if we don't have a strong ego. If it's not something that is more than just completely scattered. In martial arts, there's a lot of effort given to learning a structure. I took years ago karate, but really intensely for a couple of years, actually with my teacher. It was really a challenge. It was practice kata, the form of it, relentlessly. But then when it came to sparring, you let it all go. So you get to a certain place, and then surrender becomes a different thing. So how can we go deeper into this if we see that that's the way to freedom, but that we avoid it at all costs? Rumi says, your helplessness and need are the way. But we do have some sense that something's missing and that the way is about surrender, and we can work as we can with it. Okay, I want to shift gears and talk about a different reading for a little bit, and then I'd like to open it up and see if there are any comments or questions. So I don't think I'll read the whole thing through like I read the first one all the way through. I'll just read parts of it and make a couple comments. So this was written by my teacher, Lee Loslick, who died in 2010, and is excerpted from one of his published journals. And Lee's teacher, as some of you know, was the Indian master Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, and his teacher was Papa Ram Dass, Swami Ram Dass, who we were considering in terms of some of his writings. So Lee writes, Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar qualified surrender as something of the highest order. He said that surrender was given as a grace. I would add in my own words, until then, we practice as we can, praising God and aligning ourselves or preparing ourselves for the gift of surrender. It seems pretty clear to me that ego can't do this. We can't do this. But some effort on our part is needed. There is such a thing as grace. What is that? I think that that's a good question. But the universe does bring about transformation. And so if we can tap into that, then we can avail ourselves of it. And there's surrender and there's surrender. So I surrendered to the situation. I was mentioning that I was just in New York recently where I grew up, and I'm driving around with my adult daughter. And she's really a good driver, but I know the city. And I'm saying, okay, turn right here and let's just go straight. And she's looking at me at some point and she says, hey, I got this. Chill. Just surrender. Look up. So I can practice surrender in that way. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that I'm not going to speak up if all of a sudden we're coming to an intersection and there's people all around and there's people jaywalking in front of us. And whoa, do you see him? Do you see that's happening over there? You're looking over there. I mean, I might say something, but the whole principle of relaxing and surrendering, and then you're moving sometimes. But practicing with surrender rather than trying to be in control all the time is useful. And that's surrender in terms of practice. But that's different than surrender to all of life in an abiding way. And that's a really rare circumstance. But it might be where we're going, toward peace, joy, and freedom. The title of the first book that Lee Lozowick wrote was Spiritual Slavery. Peace, freedom, and joy isn't about just kicking back. It's about a lot of work for humanity, as I understand it. Do we want that? I'm not so sure. But there's something that's inexorably drawing me to go further. There's this guy who he raised his kids with his now ex-wife decades ago. And there's this thing called intergenerational trauma, where one generation's trauma gets transferred to the next generation, gets transferred to the next generation. And so parenting didn't go so well. And the kids really remember all that. And so one of this guy's kids didn't want contact with him anymore. And he really struggled with that. He really tried to control the situation and try to fix it and get her to come around. And it just pushed her away more. And then at some point, it seems like he got it. And he let it be and accepted the situation, not resentfully, but he just felt it was important to let go and accept. And he said that one day, just recently, in the last couple of weeks, his kid shows up on his doorstep. And he said that he thinks that letting go and acceptance played a pivotal role in aligning with the universe. Sometimes we think, oh, and I have done this in spades lots of times, thinking that this is the right course of action that needs to be taken. And I might actually be right about that, but the timing isn't right. Something else has to happen right now. And can I accept that? In the past, I have just pushed and tried to make this thing that I think is the right thing to happen, and made a mess. Sometimes just a light touch and then read the signs, whether it's time to do something or maybe there'll be a better time in the future or not. So this is radical. We can look at surrender in a different way, as if it's something that's already the case, as unconscious surrender. So Lee writes, it's that the universe, God, is what it is here and now, and there is nothing that we can do to alter it as it is here and now. Of course, we can struggle, make efforts, try, act, and of course things change. And in every moment, what is exactly as it is here and now. So in effect, we are surrendered, as it couldn't be any other way than it is. It's a given. Therefore, surrender is a given, not a choice. Even if we kick and scream, we are part of the whole that is what it is here and now. And the universe is surrendered to its movement, and we're part of that. So in effect, we already are surrendered. To me, the parallel way of looking at this would be to say that we're already enlightened. It's the case. But then, we said in this excerpt, In this absolute context, meaning everything is what it is, and we're already surrendered to that because it is what it is, we can enter into what we call conscious surrender, which in other words is the active participation with awareness and agreement. Since we can't change it, even though things change, we might as well agree. It's not only the diplomatic thing to do, but the intelligent thing to do, thereby sharing the burden or lightening the burden, if you prefer a bit of pretension, of the absolute. So it seems to me like we have the choice, which other sentient beings on this planet don't seem to have, to consciously surrender, to agree to accept what is. To me, that doesn't mean that we don't have opinions or want things, but it also doesn't mean that we act like a dish rag, to use a phrase my mother used to use, that we just are passive about everything. But we could accept the way that things turn out, even if it's not our preference. The alternative is to fight it. When one of my kids was growing up, he wanted to color her hair like some wild color. And at the time, it was a little bit more radical than it is now. And I had this reaction to that. And if our candidate doesn't win, should we be angry and depressed for 4 years? We have our preferences. There's not a problem with that. But when ego just gets stuck on having it be a certain way, when we're not flexible enough to move with the way the universe is moving, even if we really believe that the way things are going is not the way that they should, maybe right now, this is what needs to happen. And maybe we'll get there at some point, but this is what needs to happen now. And we don't know better than the universe. It's a radical view in a way, because we all want the better things. But it's pretty frustrating and doesn't lead to peace, joy, and freedom when we're trying to make things out to be the way we think they should be. So this thing about lightening the burden of the universe or of God, if we surrender and align with the way things are going, sharing the burden, so to speak, even if it's aversive to ego, maybe we make a contribution. We're not fighting with people about a position and everybody else is fighting. Or maybe we don't get into arguments with our mate or with others who disagree with us. We have our opinions, but maybe we can be flexible enough to accept that that's not the way this person feels. Okay. Lightening the burden is pretentious because we can't really help God or the universe. God or the universe holds all the cards. It rolls on whether we align or not. But aligning is the intelligent thing to do if we want freedom, peace, and joy. And maybe it helps in someone. So here's more from Lee. So we can move from being surrendered because the universe is entirely itself, and itself is in no way altered by our flip-flopping around like a fish out of water, pissing into the wind, trying to swim against the current that is impossible to swim against, to a surrender that is one of conscious acceptance of what is as it is here and now. A yes in the place of the ever-constant no of ego. We cannot know the place of love and gratitude that conscious surrender avails us or disposes us to until conscious surrender is true of us. I've been a therapist for 20 plus years. Actually, next Tuesday is my last day. This has been a big part of my life, and my identity, my ego identity, is tied up in that. And I'm realizing that this is some work. It's time to let go of that identification. Part of this is that in the last several months, maybe half a year, there's been talk about me doing this set of training videos, which I think would be really useful for staff to learn more about the most up-to-date information about how to work with trauma, and especially kids with complex trauma, lots of different kinds of trauma, because it requires something different. It's been actually a passion of mine to learn about this and then to practically apply it and work with kids and families. And so there's been this plan, and I did this whole thing up, like 12 different videos. I didn't make the videos, but I'm ready to go with this idea that I think is really going to be useful for staff. And then the clinical director, who was really supportive of this, leaves. And they hire another clinical director. And at first it's like, okay. And then she has a different perspective on things and doesn't want to do it. And okay, for me, this is what the universe is providing. And I'm not saying it's, just so easy, but it's clear that this is the way the ball is rolling. I will speak to that before I leave, but not so much because I've been offended or anything like that, but really in terms of what I think would be best for the organization and best for kids. And it's obvious that surrendering is what's in order here. So last thing on this, and then I'd like to ask you a question and see if you have something to say. He says, but if you need encouragement, there is no proof but the experience, the abiding experience itself. We allow the testimonies of saints and sages, mystics and masters of all the traditions, down and up through the ages, to be of some value in helping you come to a conviction powerful enough to actually inspire you to practice with some degree of reliability and consistency, tenacity and faith, to practice with this surrender. He says that there's no proof but the abiding experience. To me, that is useful. In my field, there are evidence-based methods, and there's some way to prove something. There is no way to prove this to other people or to ourselves other than the abiding experience. And that requires a good degree of self-honesty and willingness to learn. I find that working with groups is really important because I get input from outside that is always challenging me in some ways to grow. So all the masters seem to have found their own way, and we have to find ours. But we can feel and know for ourselves that we're being moved in the right direction, and that counts for a lot. We can taste peace, freedom, and joy, and we do at times, legitimately. And that can encourage us further. So what I'd like to ask you is, what is a situation where you recognize there is a need for you to surrender? Is there something in your life that you see, there's a need to surrender to that?
I really appreciate that I found this talk when I did, because I had a spiritual awakening a couple of years ago, and I've gone through multiple dark nights of the soul. And I don't really like to refer to it as ego death, because I have found it way more useful to see my ego almost like a inner child in a sense, and see it as a lot easier to work with my ego and try to reassure my ego that it's okay to let go. I'm having a difficult time finding almost any direction or anything that I even am interested in, like things that used to bring me joy, having difficulty finding what direction to go in, and that it tends to be more of a place of service. There's a lot of trust as well in that things are going to work out, but so many unknowns, and it's so easy for me to go to a fear-based way of thinking about it all. And I have to catch myself, because I know that that kind of indicates to me when it's coming from the ego. Is this fear-based, what's coming up?
Wow. I really don't like to use these grand terms about things, labels. This experience of the dark night of the soul. And what do you do in that kind of situation where the joys that you've had before seem hollow? Just a couple things come to mind. I'm not giving advice. It's not like that. But when I feel like that, and I have after some loss, for me, it's helped to spend some time in nature. It's helped to make contact with people that I trust, or make connections that have always been there, but that I haven't maintained. Not trying to fix it, but to avail myself of what help there might be outside. I wish you well.
tonight at a restaurant we were eating, and conversation came up, and all of a sudden I got short and curt, and I saw immediately that I was acting like this. Now, if I'd have been present before the action, none of that would have happened. So what that tells me is that I need to surrender being more present in my life. As a matter of fact, this presence that I'm talking about, this awareness, I somehow think that that's a part of God that's in me, that's in everyone, but I'm talking about me now. And it's that same awareness that's in my kitty, except I know that I am aware that I'm aware. And I don't think my kitty can quite do that yet. But when I'm in this witnessing part of me, there's a lot of good that's going on inside because I'm not thinking really, I'm just watching. I'm just seeing what's going on. And it keeps me from doing the thing like I did tonight. All that does is it builds up a wall and it keeps me from the peace and joy that I want in my life. So that's how I see surrendering. And I have to do more of this awareness in my life and practice it. And I find that a lot of that comes up in meditation. Sit there with this. And I have all these impressions that are coming down my stream of consciousness. And when they come up, I have a sacred word that I say, and it brings me back to my original focus. I think that there's ways that I can practice so that I can help God with his or her suffering too, and how I interact with other people. And so I'm never going to retire in this. I'm always going to keep going on and doing this until the last day that I'm alive here on earth, because I know that this is what's important. This is what's important for me. And I thank God that I have this to go on, because I see that if I was on my deathbed and scaled Mount Everest or did this, swam the English Channel, is this all there is to life? No, there's not. There's a lot more. And part of that is hanging out with all of you, learning out what your ideas are, or reading books and getting a bigger, better picture of what life is about, what truth is about.
For myself, I have learned to apologize. Like with my daughter, if I say something, or if I'm just too controlling and I'm not aware when I'm doing that, personally, I don't beat myself up for that. Surrender to not being surrendered. Cut myself a break. Love myself like I would love someone else who did that and was just unconscious. It's part of being a human being. And if I can just apologize right away, a lot of times if the other person is not triggered into their own traumas around all this and they've done a little bit of work, we can just go on a dime. If that's not the case, then maybe the other person is going to spiral with that for a while because they've been triggered by something I did. But over time, just kind of work it out in relationship. And we've all got our flaws. There's nobody who's not going to have.
I try to remember that God loves me in my woundedness, in my lack of capacity sometimes. And God is merciful to me. And the way that I can truly feel that is to be that part of God, which is in me, which is that presence again. And I find myself, if I can be in that presence, I feel closer to God. I thank poets like Hafiz. He's made me realize that God isn't this overpowering father figure. He wants to see me find joy and happiness in life.
To me, the point of view that works is to surrender to being taken care of. Because I find that the point of view of surrender that's generally held is like an adversary position. But if we can look at surrender as God is just waiting and wanting to look after us and take care of us. If we don't take ourselves seriously, life is hilarious. Surrendering to be taken care of is such a relief. And then it's easy to find how funny life is. And if we surrender our preferences, I find if I have a preference followed closely by assumptions, that keeps things very solid. And that if I can surrender to what shows up in the moment, then it could change again in the next moment. And there's no knowing what is going to turn up on my doorstep, because on one hand, I don't care, especially as I get older. It's not, is that all there is? But for me, it's, what's the point? What am I chasing after? What is the point of that? I'm going to be dead soon. Do I really want to spend my time chasing something? And to me, surrender is moment to moment, and we can never know outside of the moment what is going to serve God. And so we can just be relaxed and pay attention to what's going on in our bodies.
Surrender is just not so serious. Surrender is inherently pleasurable. So I've been reading this story of a spiritual group that went into a Chinese restaurant. And you know how this is sometimes? Somebody is out of control laughing. You don't even know what it is. I've been in that kind of situation where something just strikes you as completely hysterical. You couldn't really trace why it is. You don't even care. You're just out of your skull. And so there was somebody in this Chinese restaurant who was part of this group who was like that. And everybody in the group started laughing. And then, as the story went, people in the kitchen came out. What's going on? And they all started laughing. And the waiters and waitresses, they're all laughing too. And the whole place is turned upside down for these couple minutes, the people behind the cash register. And usually we do not surrender to joy. We hold back. I find myself when I'm laughing, trying to hold it in or contain it in some ways sometimes. But to fully surrender to joy and humor, this is part of it too. And I think this is why we see masters like Swami Ramdas being so joyful. They just naturally surrender to what comes, including all the joy, which is present a lot, especially if you're not trying to defend yourself. So also, on one of these trips that I'm in India, I remember this so vividly. I'm in this coffee shop with a whole bunch of other people from the group that I'm with. And I don't know, it's just something about being in a different place, a foreign situation, taken away from my whole world that I try to hold together in some ways unconsciously. Just being out of that whole thing and leaving it all behind. And I am just propelled into this ecstatic state. You have probably experienced this at different times, usually for no apparent reason. It just comes. And I'm in this place, I remember the name of it, called Coffee Day. And they're playing this music, and I just want to boogie. I mean, I just want to boogie all around. I just want to twirl and dance. But no, I'm feeling myself shutting it down, containing it. Like, you can't do that. And then it's the hell with it. I just start in. You think that they're going to ostracize you or something. But no, everybody just found complete joy in that. It's infectious when our joy is real and we're surrendered to that. So that's an aspect of surrender as well that really needs to be considered. So I thought I'd mention a couple of small opportunities that have come up to me to surrender to. Because I think that if we practice with the small things, the big things take care of themselves in a way. You set up this pattern of not having a pattern of relating to things and surrendering to them more and more. So I'm doing my wash last week, and it's monsoon season now. And I see that on the forecast that it's supposed to rain, but not for a couple hours. So I do my wash, and I go and I hang it up, and I come back, and guess what? Here it comes. So I run out and I grab stuff. And actually, it was long enough that it was mostly dry, but not entirely dry. I got a lot of stuff. So I just get into the house and I put a bunch of it in the dryer, but it's going to take a bunch of loads to dry this. And the dryer's not working. It spins. That's fine. But 20 minutes later, I come back and there's no heat. It's just not drying. It's still damp. And all this other stuff is all mushed together in this clothing basket. So I look for a rack. It's not going to hold everything, but I can't find the rack. I'm going to have to hang things maybe all around the house. And I'm realizing in the midst of this that I'm annoyed. Take a breath and just surrender to the situation. It's not so terrible. It takes a while, a lot longer, which is the thing I'm annoyed about, because there's other things I want to do than dry my clothes. And I bring all the clothes in and I start sorting my socks, and a sock is missing. And I find it under a blanket. I forgot to wash it. Anyway, you get the idea. These things happen all day long. I'm in a meeting with other people and somebody says something. Seems to me they're saying that I should be doing something different than I'm doing. That's what it really seems to me. To be able to surrender to the situation and stay in relationship with the person and just have a conversation. Well, this is how I look at it. Not such a big deal. Not a big deal at all. The universe is rolling along. I don't need to hold on to any of that. But I noticed the initial reaction. Okay, we can just move on. And sometimes surrender isn't just, as I mentioned, being a dish rag. Sometimes it's saying something or doing something. So there's accept what is as it is. But then there's this addition to that statement. That's always made sense to me. Accept what is as it is and act. Surrendering to others, like in the situation with this person, I had a bit of a reaction to. Not much. Nobody even noticed it, I don't think. Some people probably did, but hardly. Surrendering to others loosens the assemblage point, the way that ego operates. So if I just don't hold on to that and I just don't do the normal thing that ego does and just feel what I'm feeling, no problem. That's okay to feel that way, but then just let it go. I get bigger. So there's this aphorism that Gurdjieff had hanging up in the priory, the place where people came to work with him back in the 1920s. Remember, you come here having already understood the necessity of struggling with yourself, only with yourself. Therefore, thank everyone who gives you the opportunity. So then there are major life-altering changes that we're called to surrender to. And those don't happen very frequently. But in relationship to my wife's death 4 years ago, I will be spending the rest of my life learning to surrender to that and what has come to pass as a result. What helps me with this is having some faith that what happens is what needs to happen. And also that everything that happens is bringing us to love. I believe Swami Ramdas says this. I do have some faith in that. And also that it's possible to live in an abiding state of love, because I see that in the traditions, that there were people who that's been their state. Surrendering to purpose. Have you seen that movie Cabrini? Oh my God. There's this nun who founded this convent in Italy, and she feels this urge to go and do missionary work in China. According to the movie, and I don't know that this is factual, I actually think this part of it might be embellished a bit. She writes letter after letter to the Pope Leo, saying that she wants to go and do this, and she's told no, she should stay. But she is so surrendered to her purpose, or is it ambition, is brought up in the movie. And she goes to Rome, and she kind of tracks down the Pope, and she gets an audience with him, and he relents, but says, no, don't go to the east, to China, go to the west. to America, where Italian immigrants are living in squalor. You could say that she was surrendered to her purpose. And maybe there's something in that for us. It doesn't have to be this grand purpose. It could be a very ordinary thing. We live an ordinary life. That's what the universe has in store for us. No problem. No need to compare or to think that something else should be happening. Is it possible to surrender to our purpose? What would that be? But I want to say this thing. To me, surrender is surrender to self. We can talk about surrender to situations, but in the end, I actually think that it's surrendering to self. At some level, we know what the universe wants, how we're being guided to act, maybe in each moment, but mind is not clear. We're not sure. Do you ever experience that? I do all the time. How do we distinguish between trusting ourself and trusting ego? So this is from this book, Justice 365 by Lee Loswick. We're not trustworthy in our egos. Look how many people spend a lifetime in ethical service and then crumble in a certain circumstance. Until the moment we die, ego is not trustworthy. Don't trust your ego, trust yourself. But what does that mean? To me, where does any impulse come from? To check my email 30 times a day, to say something. Red Hawk, who's spoken here, comments on how instinct comes in a flash. It's not something that's thought through. But also, sometimes we're very impulsive and reactive. It's not so easy to distinguish between ego and self all the time. Sometimes it's clear. But we can learn how to follow what feels right. And then if it's not right, we learn. Something that helps me is working with meditation. There's conditional meditation where we are thinking and thinking and thinking, working out how our day is going to go or some problem. And unconditional meditation, which sometimes just arises when you are, in my view, just surrendered to reality, surrendered to the universe. You just are. To me, that's useful when that state arises, just to be with that. So why is learning to surrender important? I would say for ourselves, because a lot of us know that it leads to freedom, peace, and love. For others who need that kind of genuine help that comes when our egos aren't in the way. Someone was mentioning being with somebody and being a different way with them really helps. And the world, since there's such a need for practice of surrender, freedom, peace, and love in the world today, look around. So maybe our lives, as apparently insignificant as they seem to be in relationship to the universe, maybe they make a necessary and important contribution. And we're actually more than we think. In ending, are there any experiences or examples of surrender that occur to you, or anything that you would like to say about this subject?
I was at a silent retreat a couple of weeks ago. It was a Buddhist one. And one of the comments that I found really helpful was a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen Buddhist. And he said, "Hold your views lightly." It was in the context of a very controversial referendum we had here in Australia last year. But that idea of holding views lightly is a really good way of diffusing situations where there can be people needing to defend their own views, and that creates lack of harmony.
Yes. Very relevant these days. I mean, because the tendency is, even for those of us on the path, I say even, to get hooked. We can notice, self-observe the ways that we get hooked and see how it doesn't lead where we want to go. And it doesn't serve others so much. But we can still have our opinions, I think. But to hold them lightly, oh yeah, our relationships are much better when we do that.
I have the impression lately that with everything that I'm doing, that I'm a leaf quivering in the wind, and the wind is God. So that's like merging, and that's like surrender to me. When we align our will with the will of God, That's entering the flow. That's what that's about. So that's surrender.
One thing that's really interesting to me is that we're not trained in this at all. Learning to surrender isn't part of our education. Surrender involves a kind of inner work that we learn as we go in everyday life. And most of us grow up without having a sense of that. It's not like we can understand it so much. It's really a bodily understanding that just overtakes us sometimes. And it's the bliss of the divine. And it's here right now. And we are surrendered. But conscious surrender is what we can work on.